May the Lord be with you. A reading from the good news of our salvation according to Mark. Jesus and his disciples left from there and began a journey through Galilee. But he didn't wish anyone else to know about it. He was teaching his disciples and telling them, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. 3 days after his death, the Son of Man will rise." But they didn't understand what he was telling them, and they were afraid to question him. They came to Capernaum, and once inside the house, he began to ask them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they remained silent, because they had been discussing among themselves on the way who was the greatest. Then he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "If anyone wishes to be first, they must be the last of all and the servant of all." Taking a child, he placed it in their midst, and putting his arms around the child, he said, "Whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. As we are all aware, ambassadors are representatives authorized to speak on behalf of governments. And they were, of course, particularly important before the availability of rapid international communication. They were entrusted with grave responsibility to clearly, accurately communicate the will of their governments without any elaboration or expression of their personal opinion. In his second letter to the people of Corinth, Paul claimed to be an ambassador, according to that definition. He wrote to them that it is as though God himself were appealing to you through me. But today, who does Jesus entrust with the responsibility to be his ambassador, to represent him and carry his message? Who speaks to us for him? Well, as Jesus' conversation with the disciples clearly indicates in the gospel today, it's certainly not those who devote themselves, their time, their efforts, their energy, to becoming the greatest. Those, in other words, who engage in political, social, economic power struggles for their own personal gain. As James tells us in the second reading today, power struggles lead only to war, to conflicts, because they are fueled, as he says, by jealousy and rooted in selfish ambition. So who has Jesus chosen to be his ambassador, the one to represent him? Well, it is the child whom Jesus embraces in the gospel this morning. And that choice is deliberate, it's dramatic, it is also countercultural. In the Greco-Roman society of Jesus' time, a child was a non-entity. what we would call a non-person, had neither status nor legal rights, totally dependent, weak, and powerless, able to represent no one and nothing. And under the Roman law of paterfamilias, even the child's right to life was solely at the discretion of the father. Now, in striking contrast to the ethos of the pagan culture that surrounded them, as Rabbi David Rosen has written in a brief essay, faithful Jews have always treasured children, as he says, an inheritance from the Lord. They are bearers of his gift of life, the promise of salvation to future generations. Those whose care and welfare in the Jewish community was a solemn obligation, a responsibility not simply for the parents, but also for the entire community. Now, acting and speaking from this Jewish tradition of love and respect for children, Jesus' embrace of the child as he was embraced, as a child of God and a child of Mary, signifies his self-identification with the powerless, the marginalized, the vulnerable, in whatever culture, age, or condition. And this is Jesus' very deliberate and direct response to the disciples, who today, in his words from last week's gospel message, continue to think not as God, but as human beings. They fail to understand that greatness, as James emphasizes today, is defined not by power, not by privilege, by position, but, as he says, by the wisdom from above, which cultivates peace and sustains right relationships with God and others. It is really the mindset, it is the attitude, which he then summarizes in 7 different virtues opposed to the violence of jealousy and ambition. Because Jesus wants his disciples, he wants us to understand that he has chosen them, he's chosen us, not because of some purely hypothetical and imaginary greatness, social status, accomplishments, reputation, even for our potential. This discussion that the disciples are having is quite simply a waste of time, because it focuses on a question that doesn't really matter. What does matter, very obviously to Jesus, is that they recognize true greatness in the child whom he embraces and identifies with himself. He who is the just one, in the words of the Book of Wisdom in the first reading today, representing the poor, the insignificant, and the powerless, whom he loves. And so if Jesus chooses children and those like them who are apparently insignificant and powerless to represent himself and therefore to teach us about who he is and who he wants us to be, then who are they? Well, of course, the list is very long. But who are they? Well, they are, of course, the children. They are the children who die violently prior to birth, because now, as in pagan Rome, society regards them as non-persons, without any social or legal status, therefore not entitled to protection. And they are the children whose deaths, physical and psychological injuries, are simply collateral damage from the violence of war. Those who are abused physically, sexually, or whose needs for care and compassion are ignored. Who are they? Well, they are, I would suggest to you, also immigrants from South and Central America, whose presence in our country may be tolerated to harvest our crops, to work our fields, to provide low-wage services to us. But because of nationalism, racism, discrimination, and our failure to enact a just and equitable immigration policy, live in constant fear of deportation, without any realistic possibility of ever actually attaining the full rights of American citizens. Who are they? They are the refugees, as we've heard in recent days, from Haiti, seeking to escape the destruction of natural disasters. They are, of course, the people of Afghanistan, fleeing from the violence of war, persecution, political repression, the denial of their human rights. All of these people seeking simply an opportunity to live in peace and to have a promise of a future without fear. Who are they? Who are these insignificant people whom Christ represents? The indigent, the neglected, the sick, the elderly, those who live in twilight existences, lonely, forgotten, in nursing homes and in healthcare facilities. It is these, I would suggest to you today, that Jesus has chosen to represent himself as ambassadors to us. And so by embracing, putting his arms around the child who represents them, Jesus is challenging us to accept our part in his, what you might call, his messianic program. That is, to accept the opportunity to respond to their needs as we would if he himself stood before us. That responsibility, both individually and on the level of public policy, to those who in their need Jesus has chosen to represent him, is the task. And it was very memorably described by the late Senator and Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey, some 40 years ago, in a very insightful and emotional speech, when he said that the moral test of our country is how we treat those who are in the dawn of life, the children. How we treat those who are in the twilight of life, the aged, and those who live in the shadows of life, the sick, the poor, the persecuted. To undertake that task, to pass this moral test, is to live the definition of gospel greatness.